decisions about where to live and where to go to school, which I think is important because as it was brought up in the previous discussion, I think we have neighborhood schools and parents, and sometimes we treat these things as isolated variables when in fact they're embedded settings and they're very linked. And so I want to highlight some of that through the talk. So understanding how parents think and make decisions is as critical as figuring out how to target resources, right? Especially as I think one of the speakers earlier, respondents said it's parents are conductors of these resources. And I also want to highlight that I think in part focusing on early childhood is important if you do look at Heckman's work and some of that early work on pre-K, universal pre-K and preschool, but I think it's important to remember that the young adults who move into their own, the adolescents who move into their own adulthood need help too, and many communities and institutions serve them to varying degrees of success. And so after age 6, plenty still happens, and I want to also just put that out there. Okay. So I think most of us in the room, especially given the discussions from last night, are familiar with how we might think about the way neighborhoods affect educational outcomes. So I won't go through a sociology lecture for you right now, but I know just for getting our heads around some of the things I want to talk about, we think a lot about the way school quality is distributed across neighborhoods because we know that neighborhoods and schools track very closely in the United States. Even though there are increasing choice programs, 70 to 80% of American school kids still attend their own school, which means that neighborhoods are essential for predicting school quality. Neighborhoods have other institutional resources, we know, from parks to police to other amenities, but I know school quality is one of those we think about quite a bit, and where you end up growing up determines in many cases where you go to school. We can think about the other adults and children in your neighborhood as being role models, for better or for worse, right? Social networks are a really important piece of this, and for figuring out how you're supposed to become an adult, how you're supposed to be a student. These things matter as well and are often determined not just by school setting, but also by who you happen to grow up on the same block with. Occupational opportunities are distributed unequally and in some surprising ways, but are place-based and important part of how we think about the way young people consider the relevance of their education, why they might want to invest. And also we know that violence is a big piece of the puzzle for understanding educational outcomes, and we know that Pat Sharkey's recent work brings this point home clearly, which I'll talk about in a minute. But not only because of the potential direct effects of exposure to violence, acute or chronic, but also because, as was mentioned earlier, parents have to negotiate these kinds of dangerous spaces for their kids, and they are stressed through their exposure to violence. And this leads parents to practice isolating their kids in the house, isolating them from other people, and so on. And the stress aspect of that is important. So these are a number of ways in which we can think about how neighborhoods affect educational outcomes and other important social and behavioral outcomes. And it won't take a lot to convince the folks in this room that the stakes are high, right? So we do know, the research has been converging for a while now, that growing up in a neighborhood of concentrated disadvantage reduces the verbal cognitive scores of African American children by about 4 points, which is the equivalent of missing a year of school. Right, so this is some innovative work out of Chicago that Rob Sampson and Pat Sharkey and Steve Arnabush have done. And it turns out that this only holds for black children in Chicago. Right, so the interesting thing about a lot of our neighborhoods, right, is that we see variation in socioeconomic status for most other racial and ethnic groups, but not the same way for African American families. The negative effects of living in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage don't just stop at test scores, and there's also evidence that there's cumulative effects of this on educational fortunes. So living in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty can have devastating effects on the odds of graduating from high school. So research evidence has been pointing in this direction for a couple of decades now, and there's been some definitive, more definitive innovative research suggesting this is the case. And part of the reason this happens is because of the violence in neighborhoods that are highly disadvantaged. So this is some of Pat's recent work about how neighborhood violence gets under kids' skin, right, and causes this stress response that leads them to perform poorly on tests that they take the week that a violent crime or homicide happens in their neighborhood. So what we do know is that despite a lot of moving, right, a lot of residential mobility on the part of low-income minority families, especially African-American families, despite a lot of moving, there's mostly churning between poor segregated neighborhoods. This happens over and over again, right? It happens for families who have the conventional housing choice voucher, families who move in other ways. So despite moving, families really move up, and they churn through poor neighborhoods that are violent and isolated from mainstream institutions and resources, and this also means their children remain trapped in poor schools. Most of you are familiar with this, but it's I've been working on residential trajectories for a long time now, and you see this really tenacious pattern. Pat Sharkey's also seen this through multiple generations. He's looked at national data. So what do we do about this? Right, so there are lots of different ways at which we could think about policy levers, and there has been a lot of attention on schools. Right, so let's leverage resources at schools and see what we can do. And so my read of the literature, and we can certainly flesh this out more in discussion, is that school choice vouchers, charter schools, and other major school reform efforts have had mixed results at best. There's here and there some bright spots which are encouraging, but that on the whole, the results are mixed and not quite as positive, I think, as people would have predicted. We're still learning about charter schools and magnet schools, which are heterogeneous. But on the whole, it's not clear that just focusing money on schools is the silver bullet. And because we know that integration plans, at least at the legal level, have become somewhat of a thing of the past, given the Supreme Court decisions, we have to think about other ways to get children to attend schools and live in neighborhoods with more affluent peers who've had these opportunities naturally. So how do we do this? Well, one way is to leverage where children live, right? And this is one of the things we've been talking about. We know from Ingrid Allen's work and Karen Horn's work that the conventional housing voucher does little to leverage those resources and get families into neighborhoods with good schools. So we think, well, about other efforts that have happened in the past, many of which you have worked on in this room, which are the housing mobility programs, the assisted housing voucher programs that have come as a result of legal action or a federal housing experiment. So the first of these was the Chicago Gautreaux program, which I had the opportunity to study as a very lucky graduate student back in 1997. I think that's when I met Alex for the first time. And without going into the detail of the 15 years worth of work that we all did on that program, we know that there was pretty clear evidence that children were moving to neighborhoods with better schools. Those children with Gautreaux who left the city and moved to the more affluent suburban areas and throughout Illinois in the 6 county area were going to better schools, and there were higher self-reported academic achievement outcomes in terms of college attendance, the types of courses students were taking in high school, and so on. So there seemed to be some promise there. We didn't have the kind of sophisticated data analysis and linking systems we do now to follow through test scores, but there certainly seemed the potential with the radical change in neighborhood and housing that occurred with Gautreaux for over 7,000 families. And this was certainly the case. And what I found was that even 15 to 20 years later, more than 2/3 of families were still living in integrated low-poverty neighborhoods. So there was definitely some staying power there that I think people forget the lessons from Gautreaux often because it happened a while ago, but it's powerful. And it's something that I think is still part of our knowledge base. So moving to opportunity story is more mixed. We know that there are many debates about this and lots of different findings. I'll focus just for a minute on the education results. So moving to opportunity gave families a chance to leave poor neighborhoods in 5 cities. One of them was Baltimore, and leave public housing project neighborhoods in particular and move to low poverty neighborhoods that were either in the city or the nearby counties. The education results were pretty dismal children in the experimental group who moved to low poverty neighborhoods didn't end up doing any better on their test scores than children who didn't move, in part because most of them didn't actually attend better schools. Parents that I interviewed in Baltimore shared stories about hesitation to change their children's schools. They often didn't actually get access to housing in neighborhoods that really had the better school districts, even though they were moving to slightly less poor areas. So the MTO program is complicated. It gives us some complicated lessons, but one of them is that we can't tell for sure what might have happened to children who moved to better school districts from MTO, right? Because that didn't really happen, although there are some other important lessons to learn from MTO. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about the program that came from the Thompson remedy. And we can talk more about that in discussion, but I did want to just give a little bit of backdrop because I want to present some findings from research I've been doing on this program to give a sense of what's possible and what we've been learning. So as many of you are familiar with, what I think we're consistently calling the Baltimore Mobility Program, or the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program that came from the Thompson case, allowed families to have a chance to leave public housing, former and current public housing families, to leave poor neighborhoods in Baltimore and move to more affluent middle-class neighborhoods with better performing schools and much lower levels of poverty and crime in the metropolitan area, sort of more of a regional housing opportunity to live in neighborhoods than had been previously given to these families. In particular, families used their housing voucher and the counseling they received from Metropolitan Baltimore Quadal, and thanks to Jim Evans and his staff for years of providing me with data on this and doing this amazing work. Through this counseling and through the voucher, we're required to lease up in neighborhoods that couldn't be more than 10% poor or have more than 30% African American residents or 5% of residents living in subsidized housing. So families could decide where to live within allowable tracts and with housing counselor help. So I'm not doing justice to all of the work that's happening at MBQ, but just again to give you a little bit of sense that the program operates very differently from the conventional housing voucher program in that housing counselors work pre-move with families who are eligible to help them repair their credit, to assess their needs, to help them understand what the benefits would be like of living somewhere else. And I think this came up earlier, which is how do parents think about opportunities for their kids, given the day-to-day challenges they face. And a lot of this counseling helps them imagine something different. And my team and I attended these briefings and watched all of the sort of the hard work in helping parents understand that there was something else possible and what kinds of benefits could come from that. So there's intensive pre-move counseling, landlord outreach in suburban neighborhoods, which helps facilitate access to housing in neighborhoods that otherwise would seem off limits or actually mostly for all intents and purposes be off limits to these families. And there's post-placement counseling after families are in place to make sure they're adjusting well. Counselors have been, and the program has been evolving over time so that counselors are helping with second moves and also teaching parents about the educational opportunities in these other neighborhoods. Suburban tours of neighborhoods is also part of the program. In part, I think it's important, I'm always struck by this, to think about how little families who've lived in high poverty neighborhoods their whole lives know about neighborhoods that are not high poverty, okay? And so a lot of our programs are choice-based these days. That's a very popular way to do public policy. I think it taps into American ethos of choice and freedom, right? So it's palatable, and also I think there's this implicit idea that choice reduces inequality, but I think that it's also clear that the implication there is that if parents don't make good decisions about housing choice vouchers or school choice vouchers, then there's nothing we can do. But I think that misses the point that we really need to take into consideration the history of these families and how long they've been living in communities that don't offer resources and for schools and for housing, and give them a chance to understand what's possible. And this is a really powerful aspect of what happens, I think, in some interventions, and is happening in particular in this one. So I know we've seen some opportunity maps throughout the room, and folks are familiar with John Powell's work, and I also was lucky to work with some of his staff in getting access to the opportunity mapping data. And so just to give you a sense quickly of where families started from and where they left with the Baltimore program, The dots represent where families started, and the census tracts are shaded from light to dark, and with respect to the opportunity index of the neighborhoods. So this is where families started, and that's where they went. So just do that one more time. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the spread. I don't have a ton of time to go into the details, but we can see that the higher African American census tracts that ranged, depending on whether we use the earlier census or the later census, 30 to 40% poor. And with their first move with the Baltimore program, we saw a reduction in African American percent from 80% to 20%, and a huge decrease in poverty from 30 to 40% to about 9 or 10% on average. If we look at post-move addresses over time, we see that these results have duration, because we do see the poverty rates are still low in current neighborhood, which is a moving target. There's some movement between neighborhoods that have slightly more African American families, but the rates are less than half of their original neighborhoods. I'll have to go through just these slides very quickly. What we tried to do at the beginning when I was working with the administrative data, just trying to get a sense of what the opportunity looks like when you link housing and schooling, we can see that the school districts that families had access to when they signed up for this program were comprised mostly of poor children. So 80% of the children in the Baltimore program were going to school in school zones where 80% of their peers were poor. Okay, and when we look at the neighborhoods to which they moved, those school zones look drastically different. So here, the vast majority of those schools have 30% or fewer poor children. And so this is a big difference in the link between housing and schooling opportunity that you can see here. And this obtains if we look at math and reading test scores or teacher qualification. So let's skip through those slides to save some time. Okay, so this is a slide that's hot off the press that nobody's ever seen before. That I'm grateful to the ABLE Foundation for helping support a study where we have been able to link the test scores and schools that all of the children in this program have ever attended. So we have their schooling histories through a partnership with the Maryland State Department of Education, and we're grateful to the ABLE Foundation for supporting this work to match this data. We're at the early stages of the data of analysis, so we don't have achievement outcomes just yet, but what we do have is we can tell where the children who moved with this program are attending school. So it's not entirely clear, right, whether you moved, you switched schools, and that was something we wanted to know for sure. And what we can tell you is that for the families before they moved, if we looked at the schools their kids were attending, this is just elementary and middle school, 81% of the kids in those schools were poor, receiving or eligible for free and reduced meals. 89% were African American. About half were scoring advanced or proficient in the Maryland state assessments. And in math, and if we look just at advanced, the students who are scoring in the advanced, we see it's only 11% or 8%. When we look at the families who moved just to Baltimore County and whose children switched schools, sometimes there's an adjustment period. For the parents may lag it by a few months. We see a drastic drop in both the poverty rate of those schools, which drops from 80% to 45%. They're now attending schools with about 38% African American peers. The advanced and proficient reading levels went from 60% to 82%. And you can see a tripling of proficiency in reading and a doubling by a factor of 3 a higher proportion of peers who are scoring advanced in math. And it's even more striking if you look at the other counties that are outside of Baltimore County. So this is actually a drastic change in school quality for these kids, and we're working, and hopefully we'll be able to share with you results in the long run about the achievement scores for these kids. So I'm pretty much out of time, but I want to just say a couple more quick things. So I've been doing field work with families for about 10 years in a number of different cities. And the one striking thing that I've noticed among a poor particularly, I've worked almost exclusively with African American parents. We're now working with low-income white and Latino parents in Cleveland and Dallas. But most of my experience has been in Chicago, Baltimore, and Mobile, Alabama, with very poor black parents. And one thing that I have seen time and time again is that when they spend all of their lives in these neighborhoods and their children attend poor performing schools, they believe that that's all that's possible. That schools are all the same, that you just have to deal with which problems are not as bad as other problems, and it's just up to their kids to learn. And one of the transformative things that I've seen in my field work with the families in Baltimore is how this changes for parents who get a chance to see how their children might thrive in other school settings. The one other point too is that is the mental health of parents, right, that comes partly as a result of being exposed to violence. It's a profound effect, and one mom in Baltimore says, it feels like you're trapped, caged, and worthless in a community of absolutely no progress. And we saw both with MTO, and I'm seeing indications of this with the Baltimore program, a big change in this as well. So parents who had a chance to see their children in different schools, they were now saying, I want to stay somewhere because this school is so good. I'm in a neighborhood now where the community and the schools push you to get where they're at and have so much more than I had before. And one mom, Marie, said, we first moved, it was quiet and that was strange for my children. They woke up and said, Mom, we slept good last night. We don't hear the ambulance, we don't hear police cars, we don't hear nothing. And Marie says, I know. You get to sleep and you don't have to jump up every time. You hear pop, pop, bang, bang. And so we see a lot of these kinds of accounts from parents saying, living here has changed my whole perspective on what's possible. And so I'll skip a couple more of these, but I just want to, I want to just point out Lola, who typifies a number of the responses we've seen in the in-depth qualitative study I've been doing, where she talks about her 12-year-old son Max and says he was happy to go to school and he was excited. It wasn't like this in the city. He didn't want to go in the morning. He comes home now to do his homework. He's not getting into trouble. He cried to go to school. She was incredulous when we interviewed her. You can't see it in the text, but she said he cried, he wanted to go to school. And it was a big change. We can skip a couple more. And we saw also this profound shift in a sense of peacefulness and relief that came also for mothers, right, which is an important part of how this translates for their children's well-being. So I think that we can do better than the status quo, right, which is partly what we're all trying to talk about here. We've seen, albeit MTO has had its shortcomings, but one of the things MTO showed is it was possible to improve mothers' mental health and physical health if they left public housing projects with 40% poverty. We know from evidence in Montgomery County that if we increase school quality and the diversity of the social background of kids' peers, we can reduce math test score gaps. And we can see in Baltimore here that families can experience a large increase in neighborhood quality, a large increase in school quality, and parents start thinking differently about how they make decisions for their children and can really appreciate the benefits of these opportunities. We saw that this was possible with the Gautreaux program years ago. We can get families to embrace an opportunity to change their lives, and I think that that's not a trivial conclusion. So I'm now negative time, I realize, but which I warned Gretchen and she's been really kind. But I have a lot of ongoing research that will continue to follow these families and other families in a number of cities to try to understand where it is that we need to put the effort in, how to understand that link between parents and there's this in social settings like neighborhoods and schools, because we can't really separate those out. We really need to understand how they work together and where we can intervene. Thank you.
So, to what extent have you in the past, when you sat down with the families, actually shown them data like that and let them choose which county is next?
As a part of the pre-move counseling as well as second move counseling, we do talk to the families about the schools, which schools their kids are in, which schools they want to go to. We talked about the Maryland report card and grade schools and provide information to the families so that they can choose which schools make the most sense for them and their family as they make that move.
But it hasn't been this kind of hard data.
And I should just add to that was folded into the Quadale program as part of a grant we got from Krieger Fund a couple years ago, and it was incorporated into the training.
I'm just harkening back to what Cheryl said, is that if we have information information that families can have, and I know you said that. Thank you.
But I just want to also say that it's profound to experience it, right? You know, compared to just getting the information, because we know there's public health experts all over the room. You know, information has varying degrees of potency. We know what's bad or good for us, and I think that you know, there was a surprise. A lot of these moms took a leap of faith, and then went, oh, you know, wow, I didn't know it was going to work this way. And so that experience that they weren't expecting, right, information or not, is really what got them to say, I think I want to do something different moving forward when we think about where to live. So the experience information package, I think, is something we want to understand.
I think I'm thinking about your talk from two standpoints. One is as a public health researcher, but the other is as a practicing pediatrician. And I was struck specifically by your discussion of the, so I was just thinking in our last conversation about what seems to me almost like kind of a false dichotomy of is it parenting versus neighborhood. And the notion that parenting happens in a vacuum regardless of the sort of environmental exposures. And I was wondering, to the extent that you're learning a lot about the mothers through your interview process, do you have sort of anecdotal experiences or you know, even sort of empirical data that suggests that their approach to parenting their children changes when they're in these new environments,
Yeah.
and how, and sort of what is that process like?
So, so I think that, so I'm a quantitative researcher and a qualitative researcher, which means there's lots of crazy stuff going on in my head most of the time. I don't recommend doing both, but you know, I think part of it is when you think about neighborhoods and families as variables, which sometimes it's helpful for clarity. So a lot of these moms and a couple dads in the program have lived for a long time in neighborhoods that you know, that are harm's way, and have learned how to survive there. So their sense of what good parenting looks like makes a lot of sense what kinds of decisions and strategies they've implemented in the past. And so that's kind of a neighborhood effect on parenting, right? And then, so introducing new social settings can sometimes be shocking, right, and a surprise, which I think is what we see when, you know, I can think of a couple of moms say, well, you know, my leash grew longer, is what one mom said about what her child can do in terms of being outside. Back in the city, she said, I had to know where he was all the time, but I guess you could say my leash grew longer. I let him go places that I wouldn't have normally, right? There's sort of a relaxing of that, and you know, a previous parenting strategy that was an effect of being in a certain kind of neighborhood has now been changed because of being in a different kind of neighborhood, right? So it's complicated, and I think, you know, what we also saw a lot of this idea of being in a new comfort zone, a sense of peacefulness. And tranquility, which came up in Gautreaux. I saw this in interviews with Gautreaux parents, with MTO parents, and also with parents here in Baltimore. They say, you know, I can now sort of reduce my focus. We think of it as bandwidth now, and start to think about other things besides having to make sure my kids are safe. We can think about what else we want to do. I can think about what else I want to do and go back to school, and we hear some of that as well. So I think it's a complex set of patterns, right, where unsurprisingly we see previous experience, you know, interacts with new experiences and shifts how people think about what they want, what's possible, and how to get it.
My question really comes from my prior work and living in California's San Joaquin Valley and in Fresno County, which some of you may be familiar with, which has huge areas of concentrated poverty, particularly in the city of Fresno. And thinking about families I know who chose to move from Fresno and from the Fresno Unified School District, which sort of generally doesn't have very good education outcomes, to the very neighboring school district in Clovis. And I'm wondering, which has really good educational outcomes for all children, and I'm wondering whether or not there are interventions or services provided to these kids as they move from a really, you know, from a district that, or a school that perhaps hasn't prepared them very well into a school where, you know, kids are achieving much differently.
So my impression has always been, and I think Barbara and Jim can speak to this specifically, but no efforts were made to point out who these kids were to their receiving school districts, such as not to make them uncomfortable or compromise, their confidentiality. I think that what we do hear about is their transition costs, right? And sometimes it's difficult to come to a new school that has higher standards where teachers aren't maybe as equipped. But I think that, renegotiating any IEPs that happens, but I think that the parents mention that teachers seem to be receptive when they're receptive, when the parents are receptive. So there are costs in the adjustment, and it differs radically for younger versus older kids. Some of the older kids maybe were attending a charter school or a charter high school in Baltimore City and stayed there because they were getting really good services already. But the younger kids, right, and this has been one of the themes that we've been seeing, some of them do struggle. And one thing that we wanted to be able to get data for, but can't, is what kinds of programming is happening within the schools themselves, the sort of tracking and ability grouping. So we did interviews actually with children themselves. And parents, and so we had a study that was qualitative in depth in addition to our quantitative finding, and in the qualitative study we interviewed children 9 through 20, and so we're still working on that data to understand a little bit more from their perspective what it was like, and so I think that as far as I know, there was no additional services given specifically to those kids so that they could go to these new schools, but there's certainly a negotiation of sorts. Is that consistent?
We had given some thought at some points about trying to get sort of some counselors, intervention counselors, that would be similar to what they have in Hartford and I guess St. Louis on interdistrict school transfer programs, where at some of at a convening that we had here on education a number of years ago, and some of the people from those interdistrict school transfer programs were here. They were aghast at the idea that we didn't have that special counseling, education counseling. We just haven't had the money to do it and haven't been able to raise the money to do it.
The range of things they do in the interdistrict transfer programs includes, parent training, to basically help parents with the transition, Saturday academies to help kids, catch up from the sending district. They have liaisons that work with a cluster of suburban districts, maybe one person assigned to 3 or 4 districts to kind of help with any issues that come up. They used to have, back in the day, actual bus monitors go out with the kids to the new schools. I think that's not quite as much of an issue now, or as necessary. Times have changed. There's also a professional development program that happens in the summer for suburban faculty and administrators, which is really innovative. It includes a bus tour of the really low-income neighborhoods that a lot of the kids are coming from, and sort of a day of learning what life is like for a lot of the kids who are coming out in the program. Because a lot of the teachers and administrators in the suburban districts they're not really in touch with that, and that's been a very effective program too. So the whole range of things has been done. I think here in Baltimore, my sense is we're relying a lot on the high quality of the receiving schools, and that's one of the things schools do well, especially elementary schools, is they take new kids coming in and try to get them up to speed really quickly. And so we're relying on those suburban resources instead of adding our own bells and whistles. But I think the bells and whistles would be very helpful too.
I have some of the same concerns, and I do think those bells and whistles would be helpful. But what I've been struck by is that kids just meet expectations. And I know one family I know where the daughter in middle school in Baltimore City was getting C's, and she went to Baltimore County and almost immediately was getting A's and B's because she said her teacher knew her name, teachers knew her name, and she stayed after school. Just all the things that we were hoping for, with no support from us, because she met the expectations and thrived. And I think that's far more typical, not that the support's going to be helpful for some kids.
Right, yeah, if I could just add one point, I mean, I'm thinking about a particular family that I know that made a transition like this. One kid in elementary, one in middle school, one in high school. And it wasn't about expectations. Both the parents and the kids were really excited. But the problem was those kids had not had the opportunity to learn as much by the grades that they moved into. And so there was this education gap. And that took, frankly, a few years to fulfill. And the kids were so stressed out during those years because they had come from these schools where they were good students in their old school, and then went into this district where the expectations were completely different.
Well, my name is Sabrina Oliver, and MBQ do offer summer help with summer camps, and some of the summer camps that they provide money for does have education incorporated in the summer camp, and they're good. So,
Talk about your experience in the Anne Arundel County schools a little bit.
I moved to Anne Arundel County with the Housing Choice Voucher, and it's been a success for me and my children. My son went from complete failing from 1st grade through 9th grade. Went to Anne Arundel High School, which and they passed him along even though he was not achieving, was not learning. And if it wasn't for the help of me being determined that he learned something, he would not have adjusted as well as he did at Glen Burnie High, where he now attends. The school system is shocking. To piggyback on what you said about the family, it's really a shock to go from Baltimore City to a school that go from Baltimore City school to a school that that are teaching their kids properly. It's shocking to kids who are not learning as well, and it's been very good for my children. My son, like I said, from failing to a high school scholar, and I'm very proud. And he had learning disabilities as well. So with those learning disabilities, they were able to teach him because he was comfortable in his environment. Like they knew his name, they were able to teach him the way he learned. So that really helped my son to achieve, and that move was great. Whereas Baltimore City, I got no help. No one understood me, no one understood him, and his issues was not addressed. So I'm happy for the move.
It's interesting that right before I came, we've been doing this a long time, and we have lots of stories, and we have lots. But your story reminds me of a lady who contacted Dimitri McCain right before he came in to say one way her experience, to sort of speak to you, her experience was her child. They'd made the move. And this is something we've heard of over the years, and we've been doing it for so long. But essentially, the school recognized this child was not perceived to be a child of the Walker program or a mobility program or anything. It was a child that moved into a jurisdiction, though, that was certainly whiter and certainly higher income. But the school assessed that this child was behind in terms of their preparation. And so they called the mom and called our client, and she called to tell us. She said, the school recognized that she was behind, and they took it upon themselves to sort of set up a special thing to catch her up. The teacher thought she was quite capable of catching up pretty quickly, but just needed that. All that happened without our intervention, without a big program intervention. And she was just really happy. She was happy on a lot of levels because she was treated like a parent who cared about her kid, and they identified a problem and didn't just write it off. But I think one of the things that we've seen is sometimes when our kids, there are challenges to going into different schools and with different expectations and frankly different social situations. Some kids do have some bad experiences, some have great experiences. But where the school system is not as stressed, with a lot of kids with a lot of very high needs and difficulties dealing with all of the things that we've talked about here that come in a high stress, a school that treats and teaches kids subjected to the conditions of high poverty and high distress, they're sort of freed up in some ways too to be more helpful, because this kid they don't have that many kids who needed this effort. And so they were able to treat this child as an individual who was a child in their school who needed this help. They're going to give the help, and anyway, this was a success story, like you're saying. It is anecdotal, but we've seen it again and again that sometimes when these kids get into schools that are not themselves overburdened with trying to deal with too many problems, they are able to respond differently, and they sometimes will step up and do that. So I just want to say, it doesn't have to be a program through the mobility program. You don't have to do everything through the mobility program or remedy area. Sometimes you nurture situations, and the parents are hugely important, because once, if the teacher, every teacher, anybody know the teacher, if the parent's concerned, they love it. They're so excited to help, and so, because they like to have involved parents. So it can sometimes create a synergy that takes advantage of resources in the new receiving community that they didn't even, that they've been given an opportunity to be helpful, and they will respond. And that's an encouraging, again, anecdotal kind of stuff. We don't believe in research in our program, but we believe in what works, and we know that works.
So just to follow on what Betsy was saying, I have a good friend who's a teacher who's taught in a whole array of schools, and the analogy, the sort of way she discusses this, I think is a good analogy for this effort as a whole. She'll say, Erin, if I have a class of 15 kids and 3 of them come from a high poverty background, as a teacher, I can handle that. I can give the kids the extra help they need. If I have that same class of 15 kids and 10 of them come from a high poverty background, we're done. I can't teach anybody. And when I talk to particularly suburban audiences about this, it's that sort of clicks in for them, understanding this whole thing of what we're trying to do in context. And so that's one point. The other is that my kids actually go to one of the chef magnet schools, and it recently had a sort of expanded to have more kids from Hartford. And the first year of that was very hard for the school, and then they made all kinds of adjustments. They sort of were able to put the systems in place, and it works now. So I think capturing what those systems are and what's working and how they manage that, I think, is a really important thing. And then the last thing I wanted to say, the other thing that's really clear in this magnet school system, which is in a suburban neighborhood, is in Connecticut, the special ed assistance, a lot of it comes from the local town. So it's not coming from the state. So you finally have kids in one school from different towns, and some of them from the different towns need special ed, and the kids from my town, from the white town, who need special ed, are being followed around by their special ed teacher, and the kids who come from Hartford and East Hartford, who need the exact same help, are not. And so it's I think, an example of how the actual housing integration would make a big difference in that.
My name is Tessa Hill Aston. I'm the president of Baltimore City NWCP. But I also worked for Housing Authority for over 18 years, and I was one of the people that were involved with the opportunity to move. I also took a lot of the parents around to see where they were moving to. And I think all that I've heard is that I think the children, to me, are the easiest part. I see still now with some of the parents, it depends on the type of mother that is moving. There's some mothers that were fearful and crying, and then there were some mothers who were happy about a change in their life because they wanted to see opportunities for themselves. But one of the problems is that some parents can move and get accepted into a community, but some people feel isolated. Now, there's some positive things about housing and public housing, because in some neighborhoods there's is mandatory residence associations, the RAD board, and so the people flock to that, and some of the older people would nurture some of the younger mothers. And when these mothers leave that environment, they're isolated, and that's still happening because I'm a mentor to some of those. So the mothers need a lot more holding on to through the process.